Hello, 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 and welcome once again to CorpusCast. As ever, I'm your host, Robbie Love. I'm a linguist at Aston University, and you're listening to the Aston Originals podcast, all about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society. Welcome. As you know, in each episode, I interview researchers to find out how corpus linguistics is informing the present and shaping the future of the study of language, with applications in education, health, technology, and many, many others. In today's episode, we'll explore the role that corpus linguistics plays in sociolinguistics and dialectology. Language changes and varies according to all sorts of things, including identity, community, geography, and broader societal changes. And in recent years, with the help of, for instance, social media data, it has become possible to study language variation and change on a scale once thought unimaginable. My guest today is Jack Grieve, Professor of Corpus Linguistics at the University of Birmingham, UK, and a Fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. Jack's main research interests are in corpus linguistics, sociolinguistics, and dialectology, and he's especially interested in grammatical and lexical variation in English across time, space, and communicative context. And he also develops methods for quantitative linguistic analysis and authorship attribution. Among many other publications, he's the author of the books Regional Variation in Written English, published in 2016, and co-author of the recently published The Language of Fake News earlier in 2023. So without further ado, let's welcome Jack Grieve to CorpusCast. Hello, Jack. Welcome.
Hi, Robbie. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's great to have the chance to have a chat with you here about your research. And I'm going to start with the big question that I always ask at the beginning, which is, what does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Well, to me, it just means something like studying natural language, taking samples of natural language and studying language use, studying language structure, language variation and change through the analysis of real language use, and at some kind of scale to allow for sort of comparative analysis, to now allow for empirical questions to be explored. Usually using computers and stuff, but I think it's more just really crucially about looking at natural language use. And I think it probably contrasts pretty clearly with other ways of collecting data empirically in linguistics, like say experiments or surveys or interviews, which all sort of involve, by definition, you eliciting language data, right, and not just looking at language data as it exists. So to me, that's kind of the main point about corpus linguistics, is really looking at unelicited natural language data and using that as the data for linguistics, rather than, say, people's opinions about language, or people's intuitions about language, or say the way people produce language in a really contrived context, like in an experiment or a survey.
So tell me, when you sort of first learned about corpus linguistics and more broadly your sort of academic journey, was this something that you studied as part of an undergraduate degree, or was it something that appeared a little bit later on for you?
Yeah, I did my undergraduate. I started doing my undergraduate in math and computer science at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and I didn't do very well. I failed my first intro to computer science. That put me on academic probation, and I was retaking the computer science class, and I don't know, the professor joked that if you fail computer science, you can always do linguistics. I mean, this is for 200 students. I'm not sure how many of them had failed, or probably none of them but me went to linguistics. So I went and took a linguistics class, an intro to linguistics. It was a night course at the university. And and then I got into that. Did my undergrad at Simon Fraser in linguistics, which didn't have any corpus linguistics really that I can recall. We did sociolinguistics and generative grammar and phonology and all that kind of stuff. And then I went to do my master's in linguistics after a little break. That was with That was with Paul McFetrich, who's no longer alive, and with Maite Taboada, who is still at SFU, is quite well known. And I started off as a generative syntactician, but I got really interested in I got interested in computer programming is what happened. I took a course on programming in Perl, and then you need to work with the corpus, and I really, really liked that. I think my first project was trying to figure out the given a text, what language it was written in. I built a corpus of 50 different European languages, dialects and languages that I collected online. And so that's really what got me into it. I did my master's dissertation was on authorship analysis. So that was corpus based. And then based on that, I decided I wanted to go do corpus based dialectology because I thought that was kind of an interesting different way of doing authorship analysis. So I went to Northern Arizona and did that with Doug Biber. So then obviously at that point you're a corpus linguist. And so I did my PhD with Doug at Northern Arizona. I think I finished that in 2009. I then went to Leuven to work with Dirk Heer-Arts, the cognitive linguist, as a postdoc. But there I was really kind of just doing my own thing. So I worked on corpus-based dialectology. As in I wasn't doing cognitive linguistics really at that time or ever. And then I got a job at Aston as a lecturer there in forensic linguistics, and worked with Tim and Chris and people like that, Tim Grant, Chris Credens. And then I don't know, I think it was 2017, I moved here to Birmingham as a professorial fellow first in corpus linguistics, and then as a professor in corpus linguistics since I guess 2020 or so. So that's my basic kind of journey through it. So never really working in corpus linguistics until as my actual job title until I came to Birmingham. I was working in a cognitive linguistics program as a postdoc and then as a forensic linguist, but always doing corpus-based stuff. And obviously, Dirk Heer-Arts and Tim Grant do corpus-based stuff as well. So I was always in corpus research.
So you said one of your first experiences of working with corpus methods was comparing one text to a corpus comprising lots of different languages and essentially trying to kind of which one is it the closest to and the sort of authorship element being, basically working out who or what this text is compared to a bank of lots of text, right?
Yeah. So the first thing I did, I hadn't actually thought about till I saw the question, which was the very first thing I did was just was this written in French or is this written in German? But also is this written in Picard or other kind of pretty narrowly defined languages of Europe? And then I did that, I think, for a Perl programming class. And that was the first time I really worked with corpora. And then I decided, well, instead of trying to identify languages, let's identify authors, right? And so I started working on that problem. And at the time, I didn't realize that there was a lot of work on it. So I did a bunch of work that was kind of redundant, but then eventually sort of figured out an angle that was good. But yeah, that's those that they're kind of doing comparative analysis of, say, varieties of doing comparative analysis of language and language variation and dialect variation and author variation. That's really where I started and kind of still what I do really.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that now and sort of look at some examples of your work in computational sociolinguistics. We will return to some of the sort of forensic applications a little bit later on. Sure. And you mentioned Maite Taboada as well, who we just had on the last episode.
Oh, great.
CorpusCast as well. So that's quite nice sequence there. But let's turn to sociolinguistics to start with. And you've done quite a lot of work looking at regional variation in America, in the US. In American English, looking mostly, I think, at quite large Twitter corpora. What motivates this sort of research? Is it based on, I suppose, a curiosity from a methodological perspective? What can we learn by looking at a really big corpus of Twitter data, or is it more about the curiosity of what will we find about the linguistic variation, or is it both?
when I first started, so it's both Twitter data, but originally, and actually probably more of my publications that are directly on kind of like regional variation and trying to find dialect was on like this big corpus of letters to the editor. I mean, it seemed big back when I compiled it for my PhD. It was like 25, 30 million words or something like that, which seemed big. It's obviously not big compared to the Twitter data, which is like 8 billion words. But, I think they're similarly motivated, right? And kind of, I think the main thing that the scale, as you increase the scale, like when you go from 30 million to 8 billion, what you end up doing is two things. You can get more kind of fine-grained regional patterns because you have more data points, like across a map. And then also you can start looking at rare features. And so part of the shift that happened was moving from grammatical analysis of the letter to the editor stuff, and then moving to more lexical analysis of the bigger Twitter data because, just I guess as most corpus linguists know, like these are rarer forms often than the grammatical forms. And so as you get more data, you can look at lexis more. What really motivated it was initially I was doing this authorship analysis work, and I just said to myself, like, it'd be really useful if we could do just like we can identify who wrote the text if we have a couple of authors. It'd be really useful to be able to figure out the regional background of an author. So that was really the thing that motivated me. And when I first started my PhD, I don't remember if this was like as I was proposing the PhD or when I started, but it became pretty quickly apparent, right, that what we really lack is like any knowledge of there wasn't really supposed to be regional variation in standard written English, for example, or in any kind of written English. So, that's a bit of a problem if you're trying to automatically identify the regional background of an author if there is no regional variation in English. And then the other thing I found was that that most studies of regional variation focused on lexis to an extent, but these are often very kind of like strange words like farming terms or flora and fauna terms, like things that aren't going to be very useful in an actual kind of corpus study or in a applied context, right? It was all based, most of the more kind of serious work or kind of larger scale, more systematic recent work was based on phonetics and phonology, which is the same across sociolinguistics. And I think that's largely because of the limitations of non-corpus data, right? Like you can get a lot of phonetics data pretty quickly. There's not that many vowels there, you know what I mean? Like so you can do more systematic studies. And so, so then very quickly it stopped being about the applied problem, which I've never really dealt with. Like I've never really gotten back into doing proper like identifying of regional backgrounds. It's something we're working on right now. Dana Romling here is doing this as her PhD. It's work we're doing at this moment, 20 years later to some extent, but we never really got back to it, right? And so it very quickly then became more about showing that regional variation exists in writing or testing if it exists, trying to map grammatical variation for the first time across the US. That became a real motivation. And so it became very descriptive in that sense, right? Like really about trying to descriptive and also theoretical in the sense of trying to challenge the limits of language variation, like that we can find it in standard writing, that it's very patterned in grammar, in this kind of stuff. And so I think it was mostly, although it might have been motivated by this applied goal, it became very quickly kind of motivated by describing language variation, by kind of trying to test how diverse it is, and also just by somebody who kind of likes maps and stuff. Like I really liked the cartography angle of it, and learning about spatial analysis and learning how to make maps. Like that was a big motivator too. I've always liked geography, right? So it was sort of an intersection of linguistics and geography, which I liked.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about those maps in a minute, but just returning to what you were saying there about other approaches to sociolinguistic research. Obviously, the other approaches, a lot of them that you mentioned, sort of long predate the use of corpus methods in this context, especially the data of the scale that you've been looking at, especially with the Twitter stuff, where we're really into the billions and billions of words. What I'm saying, I guess, is that there was already an appreciation or a body of knowledge about regional variation, for instance, to an extent. What has your approach and others who look at large data sets, applying computational methods, what has that kind of extended or contributed, beyond what was already assumed to be true in this context?
Yeah. So, I mean, like dialectology, is a field that predates modern linguistics, I guess. I mean, doesn't just predate like modern linguistics from the 60s, but it predates modern linguistics from the early 1900s or something, right? So I think it's probably a field that's existed before linguistics was called linguistics. And, and they did huge amounts of data collection there. I mean, it's until corpus linguistics came around, I imagine dialectology was the most data intensive area of linguistics, right? Like just this need to like collect all this data from across a region was really a big job. And in fact, the rise of modern sociolinguistics in the 60s, around the same time as generative linguistics, it's partially like was a response to generative linguistics. It was also like partially a way of like doing urban sociolinguistics, a way of actually doing this on like a more reasonable way that it take huge amounts of money, right? To study language variation, it's much easier to go to New York City and collect data from in New York City than it is to travel around and collect data. And so, yeah, you're right, the scale, but even the scale of the 30 million word, like letter to the editor corpus was huge at the time. It quickly got dwarfed, right? Like it very quickly got dwarfed. And I'm glad that I was part of the group of people who were dwarfing it, right? But it, at the time that was huge. It was way bigger than any data set that had been collected. And it was really unique in terms of the size. But I think maybe what was more important about it, and what is still true about that work, even as the size has been just, kind of dwarfed, like I said, is that it was really focusing on unelicited language data, like actual language use data. And I don't think there was almost anything in dialectology that did that before that. That's those studies I was doing. So the traditional way of doing dialectology, which did collect large amounts of data, was to do surveys, right? So to go around and to interview people in person initially, but in 2006, from data collected in the 90s, Labov and Ashenboberg published the Atlas of North American English. That was all based on phone interviews, right? And so, aside from the scale, like there is somewhat a limitation in scale there, or at least it's really expensive to do things at large scale, which is part of why there's so little research on American dialectology. Like I think my study was really only like the third full American dialect survey after the Atlas of American English and the Dictionary of Regional American English. Is that you can now do it not just without having the observer's paradox, which is they're saying that, like, when someone from the North goes into the South and interviews somebody from a different social group, that they might adjust their language to that. But, collecting at scale and at a much more economical way. So we could do it a lot quicker. And then we could also kind of get real language use data. So we could move away from either doing interviews where, you hope they use the words that you're interested in. But if you're doing vowels or phonetics and phonology, you're pretty confident that in an hour interview, like in this interview, I will have uttered probably every vowel in the English language. You know what I mean? So you can then look at it, but I probably will, utter obviously a fraction of the grammatical constructions and a fraction of the lexical items. And so you can A, get that data without directly asking for it. And then B, you can get it from a lot of people much quicker without, I didn't have a team or like big, huge grant to fund it, all the data collection. I just did it myself, right? And so that's really what I think is the big advantage of those things and how it's different from previous research. And I think it opens up this possibility of looking at levels of analysis that we had trouble looking at, grammar in particular. Like you can go do a survey and ask lexical questions if you know what you're asking for. You can show people a picture and ask them what they call it. It's really hard to ask for grammatical constructions, right? Like these are things that are are hard to elicit from people because you can try to ask them directly, but who knows, people don't know the terminology. You can then try to give them examples, but obviously then you've already kind of you kind of primed them to give you different answers, stuff like, you know what I mean? So
yeah, and it also precludes you from discovering new sort of innovations that you can't.
Yeah, I mean, you can't do it, right?
You don't know what you're asking for, right?
Yeah. That's. I mean, I think with the grammatical stuff, with the grammatical stuff, it's maybe less of a big deal because you still need to go through and kind of like search for, like, you still need to kind of know what you want to look for because you have to find the features. However, at least you don't have a set list of questions. You can go back into the corpus and find things you never thought to have looked for. But if you're doing like a survey in particular, you really need to have all these questions predefined. We do a lot of work on Lexis, especially on the Twitter data. So most of my grammatical stuff was on the letters to the editor. Most of my lexical stuff's been on the Twitter data. And on the Twitter data, it's great because you can look at, like, we've done a lot of stuff on emerging words. So these are words that we don't know about, right? Like, it's really hard to ask for these words if you don't know about them. Like an emerging word by definition, like a new lexical item that's taking off, unless it's in dialectology, like dialectologists don't going to know it, right? Like they're not 12-year-old kids, right? Like they don't know these new lexical items. And so, having a corpus means that you don't have to like pre-select the features that you're looking at. And it gives you a lot more flexibility and time and possibility to find features you didn't know were interesting, both by, just trying to count things that you discover are interesting as you go, but also by trying to like literally discover the features in the data.
Yeah. And you mentioned the maps that, I think have sort of captured the imagination and attention of the sort of broader public discourse, and journalists have repeatedly over the last several years reported on your dialect maps. I believe I've been receiving messages from our producer Sam. I believe that we might have one or two of these maps that may appear at some point on the screen.
Yeah, they're all mine. They're all mine. Yeah, like that's mine.
There you go.
They're rarely attributed to me, but the garish color scheme and that GI Z score gives it away.
This is definitely you. Yes. Yeah.
yeah, definitely me.
So I guess with this as an example, what are we seeing here, and how? Because with the Twitter data, I guess it's not every single. Well, first of all, how do you identify who is American or who is using American English? But then also in terms of the geographical aspect, I imagine it's users who are sort of self-defining as, I am in this place. I'm located here.
Located. So these are people whose smartphones back in the day were recording where they were whenever they tweeted. That's the only criteria we use. There's no other filtering here. So we don't try to figure out where someone's really from. I see this as just kind of being the like kind of default model for kind of doing a synchronic dialect study, right? So, you'd kind of just want people where they are. So it's kind of like if you sat on inside one of these counties, these are all subdivided by counties. You can kind of see it in especially in the West there, you can kind of see where the borders are of the different submarines. And so the idea is just that this is just what you would see if you ran through tweets that originated from this region. A lot of the stuff about, I think this is a good example or a good topic is sort of like this idea that like dialect studies need to focus on people who have lived in a spot their whole life. That was really just initially proposed as a way to handle the fact that you're only collecting a couple of people at each location. And so you better be sure that you got people who do something local, or else you wouldn't find anything. And then also, initially the motivation was explicitly that they were interested in preserving old dialects before they disappeared. And so they wanted people who represented the language as spoken, years and years before. We don't have any of those interests, and we have tons of data at each location. So we do proper synchronic dialectology here, meaning this is just a snapshot of language in this 1 year period. And, and it's very robust patterns. In fact, they're more robust than what you get back by looking at two very carefully selected people, right? It's having a lot of people, there's thousands of people in each one of these. So basically what this is, or sometimes hundreds of thousands, what this is there's about 3,000 counties in the US. For every tweet in the corpus, I think there's about 1 billion tweets in this corpus. This is from 2013 to 2014. So for every tweet in the corpus, it's just sorted based on a long lat into what county it was produced in. It's not sorted by individuals, so someone can be in multiple. One person could be in multiple counties, not one tweet. And then you basically just stratify the corpus based on the counties. So in this corpus, there's around 3,000 subcorpora. Each one corresponds to one of these U.S. counties. And then each one we can measure the relative frequency, in this case, of the word dang in that county, right? So we can say, in a county in the south, it happens at a higher relative frequency than in a county in the north, right? Basically what you see there. And then we plot those results. This is a smooth map. There's also raw maps available that show kind of the same basic pattern, but it's not quite as clear. So this has been sort of analyzed and converted to a map that lets you sort of see the underlying regional signal in the data. But like for this one, it's quite strong. You'd see it clearly in the raw data too. And so that's basically all it is. It's just a bunch of these little corpora. Each one of them is a county, and we can measure the relative frequency of these words. I guess maybe one thing to say quickly is that, this is very different than traditional dialectology, right? So traditional dialectology does not look at the relative frequency of anything, right? They're not looking at the relative frequency of like how often something is produced in the way we usually do in corpus linguistics, right? Like there's lots of research in corpus linguistics where we look at, what's the rate of usage of nouns or determiners or the word the or of or in this case a lexical item, right? That's not what they do in sociolinguistics. They would look at, say, dang versus damn, I guess might be the most honest. They look at these alternations, and the idea there is that you're controlling for variation in meaning, and you're just in referential meaning. You just want to look at the variation in social meaning. So you take two words. These are common in British dialectology too, right? Like bap and bun and
yes. Oh my goodness.
So you take a set of words that has the same basic meaning, and then you plot where one is more or less frequent compared to the others, which makes a lot of sense, right? Like it shows you how this lexical choice works. But these results are somewhat surprising because I didn't do that, and yet they show really clear regional patterns. And I think it's an important point because it violates a lot of the kind of basic ideas of doing this kind of work, of doing dialectology. Dang's a pretty good one, and that you could do another way, dang versus damn. It's literally kind of like but other ones aren't so clear, right? Like what do you do with most swear words? Yeah, like that one, like there's no real word that just contrasts with it.
Yeah. So for the benefit of those who are listening, I should add, who aren't watching us on YouTube, we've just been having a look at the map of dang, and now the map of the F word is here, which basically shows around the borders, I guess. On the east and west coast, you've got an awful lot going on, and also sort of South Texas and Florida, etc.
So you see, kind of on this map, what you see is that the F word is used relatively infrequently in the center of the country, and used much more frequently around the edges of the country, which can be fairly easily interpreted. I mean, most of the places where it's really common are places that are fairly urban, or places that have large, I think you could say large African American or Hispanic populations, and urban populations. And in kind of the heartland, you see that it's much less common. If I recall, there's an article we did for quartzqz.com out there, and it shows what we did was we took these maps, we took all like 10,000 top word maps in the United States. We then correlated them all against the 2016 election results between Clinton and Trump, and we showed that this word was the best predictor of a Clinton vote. So out of the 10,000 words, the word map that matched the Clinton vote map the best was this one, as in places where the F word is used commonly on Twitter tended to vote for Hillary Clinton more than any other word. And the word that best predicted Trump is almost the exact opposite of this, obviously. So more used in the heartland and not used elsewhere, and that word was crap.
Oh, okay.
And so you almost see like an alternation right there, right, between these. Super. With
the F word, there's a fairly strong kind of, well, as with a lot of swear words, the age sort of effect, and so it doesn't surprise me in a way that if you have, I don't know this, but I'm assuming that on average, an awful lot more relatively younger people voted Clinton than they did Trump, and that's
right, I guess.
Known kind of correlations of these various groups, right?
Yeah, I think it's also, though, but it's also just, it's more this kind of, it maps on nicely to kind of the urban-rural divide. That's, I think, more what's happening here, in the sense that I think you're right. I don't really know how age maps onto the rural-urban divide in the U.S. I assume not this clearly, right? So
right, yeah.
There is age variation in the U.S. without a doubt. You know, places like Florida or older. Yeah, there it is. So this is
Sam is going wild now. We're oh yes, this is what you were just telling us about.
Yeah, is that right? Yeah, so there's crap at the very top. That's the most Trump word, and I think the F word is at the very bottom of that like diagram. Those are all the words in the corpus. And
I see. I see.
And then, there, there it is. Yeah, there it is. And there's IPA right above it.
IPA, dope, brunch, Henny, cocktails.
Yeah. So those are very like urban words, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And then at the other end is all these like, I think truck and road and farm and stuff right at the other end. These are, I mean, I think a lot of these words aren't surprising at all. They're exactly what you'd expect by the urban rural divide, but I think the peak words either side are very unexpected, very related to each other in an interesting way, and maybe pretty informative about the differences in populations who vote for different parties in the U.S.
Yeah. What do you think it is that sort of fuels this kind of curiosity? You know, this sort of research, you know, your own and other studies that look at, you know, with social variation or some sort of kind of broader sort of scale look at which words are more or less popular, things like that. What is the sort of, you know, it does get covered quite a lot. It's usually something that ends up in the press. Why do you think it is? What is it that motivates this perhaps inherent curiosity and interest that people have in learning more about these trends in society?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is that it's like visualized as well, right?
Yeah.
Like including there on the maps, but also on those other plots you showed. So I think the visualization is a big part of it. I think part of the reason why these maps got picked up by lots of people is because they look fairly nice, you know?
Yeah.
I said the garish color scheme before, but I mean, that might not have been totally counterproductive on that end. So I think that's part of it, right? People like, and I think, you know, increasingly what you find is there's just all these like online, you know, so-called news organizations that need to fill up the page, and they really want to fill the page up with pictures too, right? Like they really want you to click on it. So I think part of it's just that, like it's nothing more than that. I think that's maybe why, in my mind, the regional stuff, maybe I don't look at that much other social variation, but I think the regional stuff tends to do better than anything else, right? Language change like too, right? Because that can be graphed nicely as well. I think the other thing is that it's, you know, somehow it's fairly like, it's both kind of related to, you know, kind of people's biases and stuff. Like they like kind of seeing how they're different or seeing how other people are different from them. They like the regional stuff. Like it shows these differences that maybe they don't know about, but that they kind of believe in anyway. So it kind of is a nice way of showing people how people differ. You know, I think there's probably some, you know, maybe some not totally positive parts why people like it, right? Because it kind of lets you think about how people are different than you. But I also think it's just that, you know, that this is stuff that people kind of know about. Like they have a kind of a feeling about dialect.
Yeah.
And it's easy enough to talk about too. Like, I mean, I think if we're talking about other types of linguistics, why it's not as popular, like it's all pretty easy to understand, right? Like you show people a map, they're used to seeing maps. You know, they know people who live in these different spots. They can visualize it. And then you're telling them words that they know, right? Because we're usually using, you know, everyone knows these words. We're not talking about like, you know, anaphor or something like that, right? That nobody knows what you're talking about. So I think it's all those things. But yeah, I think it's probably people have some intuitions about it. It's sort of, you know, the other thing is, right, is if you were to show like, I don't know, like variation in across sex or gender or across race, like these bring up things that are more potentially problematic, right? That people maybe are a bit more sensitive about. But when you talk about regional variation, I don't know. I think most people just find it interesting and don't really think too much about it in more of a kind of like a problematic way. And I think maybe rightfully so, right? Because we're all just where we're born, and you know, you just sort of pick up. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it.
Now, obviously, you know, in recent months, there have been a lot of changes with Twitter, specifically Elon Musk taking over, and only I think a few weeks ago there were some potentially quite challenging changes that were made with regard to access of academic researchers to Twitter data. So, you know, the obvious question, I guess, is what happens now? Presumably, researchers who have been relying on large scale sort of Twitter data, they can continue to use the data they already have, I assume. But moving forward, what do you think will be the sort of longer term impact? Where will researchers turn to kind of continue to access that kind of real time usage data, if not Twitter?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the thing about Twitter is it has lots of users, right? So it's not just a fact that it's like online, but it's very popular, right? And traditionally they made the data available for free, so that helped. That's obviously, those are both necessary things, right? But just having a platform that makes the data available for free isn't sufficient if nobody's using it. I think there's lots of things here. So I mean, the one thing is that like, yeah, so I think people have to move on to other sources of data is what's going to happen. I mean, Musk has been complaining about large-scale scraping of data off the site, and that's something you can do, not using the API, but using like third-party tools, which are arguably essentially violating the terms and conditions of Twitter. But you can do this if you want. I don't think there's anything real. Well, I don't know. I'll give legal advice here. So you could do that if you want, but like that's becoming harder. They're probably increasingly likely to crack down on it. I think the bigger thing that's happening here, right, is that all these companies. So Reddit's doing something similar right now. Reddit was even more generous than Twitter. Twitter's always had the requirement that you can't actually share your data with other people directly. You have to give them the code so they can do what's called rehydrating. You can go download them again, but it's a very slow process. So a big corpus like mine, you really, it'd take you years to rehydrate it. But I think what's really happening here is that like all these companies are starting to realize like how valuable their data is, as all these large language models are trained off of these data sets, right? And so what they're seeing, I mean, I think this is exactly what's happening with Reddit, because in Reddit, they're using the Reddit data in really creative ways, right? So you have like, on Reddit, you have things that are like too long, don't read summary things. So they'll give you a website and then people will summarize it for you. It's just training data for automated summarization, right? Like it's perfect, right? There's lots of this kind of unique ways of using social media data. And I think what's happened is these social media companies have realized that, they're essentially doing data collection for free for these big large language model AI companies, and they've not been profiting off of them. And especially when you see that lots of these social media companies have a hard time turning profits, then this becomes really like an obvious leakage in the whole business model, and one that they weren't totally expecting. We're working off these really large multi-billion word corpora for dialectology, but then nobody really cares because, it's not the most like applicable thing in the world, right? I mean, there are applications, but it's not, OpenAI level applications, right? So that's what's happened here. From my perspective, I haven't used any Twitter data. I haven't used any new Twitter data since 2015, because the geolocations was dropped in 2015, 2016. It wasn't dropped; it just went from opt out to opt in. So back in the day, if you were tweeting on your phone in 2014 when we were collecting data, unless you were, and I should say this was collected by Dianchen Guo at University of Southern Carolina, not by me directly. I did the analysis, but not the collection. But back then, if you were collecting data, like anything that came off a mobile phone would be like 95% of the time would have a geocode to it, a geolocation, like telling you the precise long and lat, where you could like zoom into you could zoom into the room somebody was in. Like,
yeah, I remember. I used to tweet with that feature on. Yeah.
Well, everyone tweeted with that feature on unless you turn it off, right? If you were on a smartphone tweeting in 2014, unless you went into the settings and like explicitly turned it on, that information was being recorded, and unless you were a private user, that information was available to anyone with the API. And so that changed in around 2015. And I think it went from 95%. I'm making these numbers up, but they're not too far off from reality. I think David Jurgens has a nice graph and a paper of his. But anyway, they dropped from about 95% geolocated to like 5% geolocated. And so it really dropped that. So we haven't actually worked with data since 2015, 2016. You can still have these, like kind of what you implied earlier on, which was that these are based on kind of like self-declared locations, and that's still there, right? Like my self-declared location says Birmingham, I think, but I'm really referencing, I don't live in Birmingham actually. I live just referencing where my work is.
Yeah.
And often those things are varied. Like some people will say England, some people will say United Kingdom, some people will say Earth, some people will say Mars. You know what I mean? Like it's totally unclear how reliable those are, and the resolution just varies wildly. And so we've certainly found, and you can see in other people's work, that when you start working with self-declared locations instead of true geolocations, even though those geolocations are on the tweet level and can vary, like one person can now produce tweets in all sorts of different places, that despite that, these regional patterns are way, way stronger when you work with actual geolocated data. And so from that perspective, I mean, the Twitter data has been, for dialectologists, has been useless or nowhere near as good as the old data for a decade. I don't know though, Robbie, if what you're saying is actually true. Like, I think there's going to be some problems with using this old Twitter data. I don't know. We'll see what happens.
So you think it might end up being, sort of prohibited that you.
Well, I think Twitter's going to try to make it prohibited. Yeah, I think Twitter's going to try to make it prohibited. I think they're probably already trying. They've always put these kind of restraints on, like you're supposed to delete any tweet from your corpus that has been deleted from the system, which when you hold 1 billion tweets is not feasible.
No.
At all.
No.
I don't think that, we'll see what happens. I mean, it seems to me that corpus linguists are probably, who are working with Twitter data, are probably bolstered to some extent by AI companies fighting against this. So if AI companies can hold the data, then so can we, presumably. And so we'll see. I think it probably comes down more to the publishers, right? So when you try to publish this research, how much do they care? So we have a paper right now in review at +1 on double modals. And we'll see. We're starting to, we're getting these kind of like requests in the reviews to kind of address the accessibility of the data. And I'm wondering if we're heading down a road where they're going to say, are you sure you have, current Twitter's permission to use this data? We'll see what happens. I don't quite know. But I suspect that, like, say, linguistics journals won't be necessarily too quick to care. But yeah, this might, I wonder. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's going to happen with it. We'll see. I don't work with it so much anymore, so I'm not so worried. But we do have a bunch of papers in review right now on using Twitter data for both American and British dialectology, and we'll see. I think these will be okay, but it might get harder and harder moving forward.
Yeah, we'll see what happens there, because I guess in my mind the fear is, I'm thinking about all these maybe postgraduate researchers, PhD candidates who started a PhD project a year ago, sort of preparing to gather loads of Twitter data, and then suddenly all of this has happened in the last year. And
what
do I do now? And
I think Reddit data has really taken off in the last 5 years as a solution to certain limitations with Twitter data, including sharing your data, but they're in the midst of doing it. I think that was part of what the big Reddit strike was about. I mean, that was more about, I think, these bots that have lots of usages for the moderators where they don't have to do things that they're now sort of expected to do by hand. I suspect those bots are even more closely related to, I don't know much about the topic, but I assume they're also related to the automatic downloading of Reddit data, which was very easy to do back in the day. It was nothing to it. In fact, there was like a whole torrent you could just download that had the entire Reddit up to that data, and it was being updated all the time. And so the Reddit data was a huge thing. And like I said, it's a bit more diverse than the Twitter data. Like, it gives you a lot of, it's not as good for regional stuff, but for other things, it's really good, because you can go now and look at, like, I don't know, let's look at this social group, and these are very finely defined forums that are on particular things that you can really go get really, like, you want data from some community that's marginalized, then that's there, right? It's what's on Twitter, it's what's on Reddit, and it's sorted for you by default and easy to access. So that's also going away. I think probably longer term, the solution is just that we'll just find other data sources, right? I mean, these data sources will just keep coming.
Yeah.
Like, another problem, Robbie, is just that, like, it's kind of a big one just in general. And that's, like, increasingly we're going to have all this online data, like, polluted, if you like. I mean, depending on your interest, with just like automatically generated text, right? Like, that's going to be everywhere. And it's going to make this data harder and harder to draw direct conclusions about human language off of, because a lot of it's going to be automated through large language models, and that's going to start filling up a lot of these data sets we're working with. I mean, there's general worry in large language model training about this problem that becomes sort of cyclical, and you just start training on your own output. And that will be a problem for large scale corpus linguistics, for sure.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's potentially a real challenge, and kind of leads me to question, or maybe will lead to researchers questioning, what is authentic language, right? Is it?
Yeah, no, it puts a whole spin on
who produces it, or is it about how it's used?
I mean,
right?
traditionally, a corpus linguist, if you're working with pre-existing data, like the one thing you know is that it's authentic data use and authentic human language use. It wasn't
Mm,
produced under experimental or another kind of data collection kind of constraints where the
mm,
observer's paradox is a big deal. And
yeah,
now you have this new wrinkle there, which is that, if you really want to look at human language directly, not kind of one step removed, because of course these large language models are all trained on human data, um, but yeah, increasingly that's going to be less and less true.
yeah. Some company uses an AI tool to help them write some corporate statement on something, and they put it out there, and that is the statement they publish. Then it's authentic in the sense that we're
Yeah, yeah,
observing how people use language, but it's not authentic in the sense that it was originally written by a human, right? So
that's right. And
yeah.
it's real language. It's out there, and
Mm.
it's just being it's being it's in the language use cycle. I mean, it's there. People are taking it in, and they're maybe not taking it in knowing it's a machine or not, and maybe it doesn't really matter in some sense, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter, but you can start seeing how this kind of stuff has, how it can start like driving language change and stuff in really weird ways, right? Like, you
Yeah.
know, if we're all learning how to write business reports by reading business reports that were written by machines, then all of a sudden what machines are doing starts to drive how language might change in that context.
Mm. Now, as we start to wrap up, there is one more thing I sort of want to touch upon, which is related to your interest that we've been discussing, which is the diachronic element. Looking at how is this sort of variation changing over time, and what are the changes, and um, one approach that is becoming, I guess, more common. I mean, my experiences with spoken data, I think, with written data, this has been going on a lot longer, but with spoken data, it's not been so easy to get diachronically comparable data sets, right? It's a real challenge. And, we're starting to see examples of that happen. There's the new BNC project with the spoken and the written stuff. There's, new members of the Brown sampling frame kind of being added sort of
Yeah.
every 15 years or so. There's examples, other examples as well. And I think that, from my perspective, the motivation to do the sorts of stuff that I and others do with the BNC data is compare the first one to the second one and go, oh, what's different, what's the same, etc., and go, what this might be, related to stuff that's changed recently, is mainly because there isn't really, so much more comparable data from longer periods or more sampling points. And so, I guess I'm sort of interested in your perspectives on this. I know it's something that you've talked about before, and so this kind of perspective on I guess the validity in a way of doing this kind of comparing 2 points in time. And you can't say this is definitely change, obviously, but is there a contribution really to the language change discussion as opposed to other sorts of discussions that are maybe not so contentious, just around broadly about describing how language is used in these contexts?
Yeah, so I think in general, like comparative corpus linguistics, when you're comparing across two corpora that were collected differently and not at the same time, like not at the same time, but like in the same in the same attempt to collect data. So I think if you have like a stratified corpus where you collect a bunch of data and then you can stratify it, and you can stratify it along various ways, like say, you can stratify by gender, you can stratify by register, you can stratify like we do by county. And we also do a lot of work in that on that Twitter corpus in a 1 year period where we stratify by day and we track changes over the course of a year, right? And there, what you have is a whole bunch of these time points. But let me get back to the time point question. But I just more broadly, like when you're making these comparisons, like I think it's really hard to make the comparisons when the data was collected differently. So like the ICLE corpora, making world English comparisons, comparing the different Browns or the different lobs and these kind of things, like they were collected under really similar conditions. And so there's all these like confounding variables there that are always kind of there in observational corpus research. Like you don't really know, like if you take like American tweets and British tweets and compare them, you find some difference. Like you don't know if that's really from American or British. It might be that the American had like, I don't know, like much higher on average education level than the British, or might be much older than the British people, might be much different gender split or different economics, right? You just don't know. These are uncontrolled factors that are there. And so at best you can say like, well, we found this difference. Now we need to figure out why that difference exists. And so I think it's really hard to do that and to be very confident that those differences are even existing if you were to like kind of sample out equally from these populations, unless they were kind of sampled together. And so, so like the old BNC and the new BNC, I don't know, they're not totally comparable, really. There's not a lot of, like, there's even less faith than normal. Like, even like, if you look at like one of my Twitter corpora, there's like not really any faith that the people from Arizona are comparable to the people from California, except from their regional background. That probably isn't true at all, right? Because there's other demographic differences across the US. It's not like if you map gender, age, economics, voting, that those things are all just kind of, totally consistent across the US. So, it's hard, but when you're doing it with stuff that's even more like disconnected, then the number of confounds is increasing and increasing. We should be less and less confident that that there's a difference. Now, for lots of extra linguistic factors, there might be legitimately just two data points, really. So if we want to compare British and American English, there's British and American English. Like, we can obviously subdivide those into smaller ones, but it's reasonable enough to ask, like, is there a difference between British English and American English in general? We know there's lots of differences, right? Like, we know from experience that, mine and your accent sound different because I have a North American accent and you have a British one. So when there's two data points, then, okay, so you always have this problem with corpus linguistics. Like, is it really comparable data? And like, what can we really assume is the cause of the difference? It's not necessarily, in fact, it's usually not the thing that we're looking at. Like, the difference between British and American English isn't from nationality, right? Like, like my son has American nationality, but he's born and raised here in Britain. So it's not nationality, right? So is it like, well, how much time you lived there? Well, I guess, but then my son, like, grows up with me and my wife who speak North American English. So he's not quite a very good representative of British English then either, right? Like, we're obviously, when we say British American English, like, we're talking about a whole confluence of different things around history and education and culture and, all sorts of things that matter here, right? Now, when you do time, I think it's even harder. And I think the reason it's harder with time is that, like, time is not something that's just a binary category, really. Like, you might ask, like, how is English different from the 1990s to the 2000s? And then you get these two. That's fine. But you couldn't then, by seeing that there was a difference between the 1990s and 2000, then extrapolate from that, like, long-term language change. You couldn't from that point, you don't know if things were even, say, lower in the 1980s and even lower in the 1970s. They're going to be even higher in the 2010s and 30s. Like, you need some kind of trajectory to establish that, because time variation, there's all these like cyclical patterns, right? Like, I don't know, if I measure the temperature in December and then in July, right? Like, I'll see a rise, but I wouldn't want to then assume that it's rising. I mean, I might not right now, it's so cold, but you know what I mean, right? Like, you wouldn't want to assume then that the temperature is just rising endlessly. I mean, this almost might be true in today's society, right? With global warming and something, but you know what I mean? Like, it's a cyclical pattern there. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's dark out, it's light out at 6 a.m. and it's dark out at 10 p.m. Therefore, it's just going to get darker and darker for the rest of our existence. And so I think that's the real reason why you need these multiple points on time. I think it's saying, like, there's a difference between, so notwithstanding the issues around how comparable are these corpora anyway that we're comparing, but I think we could say, like, look, given these two corpora, we can observe that there's a difference between, this time period and this time period, but whether or not it's a change seems to me a question that we need some kind of trajectory with at least 2 or 3 points. I mean, at least more than 3 points. The other thing here, of course, is that with 2 points, you'll always see a change. Like, you'll always see a difference, right?
Yes.
Well, they'd never be exactly the same. And how different they have to be a difference isn't an easy question. So if you have 4 points and you see they're all rising, then that's a lot better evidence of rise than 2 points that show a difference.
Yes.
2 points would have always showed a difference, right?
Yes. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I think, from what you're saying, it's, I guess, a distinction. Yes, the procedure is part of it in terms of, from a practical perspective, the design of the corpora, which is an issue with any type of comparison, whether it's synchronic or diachronic. But aside from that, it sounds like it's more to do with how you interpret what you observe, right? In terms of,
exactly.
There's a difference here.
What you're trying to generalize.
Yes, yeah, and there's a distinction between saying, okay, it's different from this corpus in the 90s and more recently. Another thing would be to say, in another 20 years, it's going to be even lower or higher or whatever, right? Sort of trying to predict a trend, or I guess even predict backwards a trend, although that's not as difficult in that at least you can maybe look at what research in similar context. It might not be exactly the same context, but you might know, throughout the 20th century, there's been a general decline observed in X. I'm not looking at exactly the same thing, but is it similar-ish?
As it's consistent with that.
Yeah.
I think that's all we can ever do, right? Is like, corpus, we're never, in a proper corpus study where we're working with unelicited data. I mean, there's always these confounding factors that we've never controlled for, right? We don't have like experimental control. We can't at the end of the day be like, well, this definitely caused this. And in fact, like I say, we generally assume it doesn't. Like, we don't really think that nationality or gender causes language variation. We think that it's correlated with language variation, but nobody thinks that like, you could do an experiment on this. You could literally have like, get the British government in here. We could get some American tweeting, and then we could like get the British government to make them British and then have them tweet again. And they wouldn't change their language, right? So nationality is not like the constant factor. And so in corpus linguistics, we don't do that. We like try to find patterns, and then we try to explain those differences, but not from the experiment itself. We didn't do an experiment, right? So then we say, okay, well, what's different between British and American English? And or the history of British and American, we start looking at that, right? And we say, okay, well, this happened because, I don't know, people moved here and they took the British forms and they left them here and then they changed in Britain, but they're, fossilized in parts of the US or something like that. Like, these are explanations, but they're not just like nationality explanations, but that's the pattern we observe and that we try to explain. And then we hope that by explaining it, we get to a better understanding. But we never really know that for sure in a way. Although the other end is that we know the difference is real. Like, we do know that there are differences in American English. Like, they're not just something that we can isolate in an experiment, but have no reality in the real world. So that's the trade-off. And I think it's probably smart for corpus linguists to appreciate that trade-off and to like not refer to our studies as experiments, not to treat our results as causative, and but on the other hand, to be more confident in the external validity of our results, that these are real things that happen in the real world, that they matter, that there's a difference we can observe in the corpus. So I think that's that trade-off that I think a lot of us in corpus linguistics especially have been I think a lot of linguists have been pushed towards this idea of like kind of linguistics as an experimental science that's really neat and tidy and can be divorced from the social world, and that we could just like do this in labs and figure things out. And at least when we're talking about how language is used in the social world, which is what corpus linguists and sociolinguists and discourse analysts do, then that kind of paradigm is not right. And trying to force or pretend that we're in that paradigm is only to our detriment and doesn't really move things forward.
Well, on that note, we're going to bring things to a close with our final 3 quick questions, which I recently changed them. Actually, these are a fresh batch that are just been rolled out recently. So, first one, if you're ready, is research in corpus linguistics living up to its potential?
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly, it's the biggest methodological advance in corpus linguistics over the last like 40 years or something like that. It's omnipresent across all areas of linguistics now, and it didn't used to be. I was at a Chomsky day in Reading about 6-7 years ago. It was a general linguistics day, and halfway through the conference, someone said, "Can we finally start looking at usage data now? Are we ready to do this using corpora?" And half the room stood up and clapped, and the other half sat down and didn't clap. But even there, right, like even in the spot that was most critical of corpus linguistics, it's really common. It's increasingly common in sociolinguistics now. Like the computational sociolinguistics is essentially a movement towards using corpora in that field. It's common in all areas, really. I think it's by far and away clearly the most successful methodology, at least in linguistics over the last 50 years. I don't know how much corpus linguistics, the field that we're in, is responsible for that, actually. I mean, we're certainly very influential in things like in certain areas, applied linguistics, discourse analysis, register analysis, in areas of obviously around lexicography, English grammar, collocation, stuff like that. But we can't take a lot of responsibility for the growth of corpora in psycholinguistics, in sociolinguistics, really, in other areas. These are things that just happen because they were good ideas and obvious. And once the data comes online, nobody really doubts it, except a few people who, for theoretical reasons, don't like the idea of looking at usage data at all. But for most areas of linguistics, it's sort of what anyone coming in would think you would do, right? Like look at corpora. It's kind of, if a physicist or an undergraduate is just smart comes in, then doing corpus linguistics makes a lot of sense for most research questions.
And speaking of people who are coming in, the second quick question is, what is your number one brief piece of advice for new students who are embarking in corpus linguistics?
Yeah. I'll give two. Okay. So one would be to learn how to program,
Mm-hmm.
to learn how to process these corpora, because as they get bigger and bigger, and as more and more data comes online that you might want to get and build corpora out of, it becomes harder and harder to do this by hand, right? Mm-hmm. So one thing is to learn how to, and that's even true for spoken data. You can see how soon we'll be auto-transcribing things, that's already happening. So I think that's the one. And the other one would just be to probably not think of yourself first and foremost as a corpus linguist, but to figure out what area you want to work in. So if you want to work in conversation analysis, or you want to work in sociolinguistics, or you want to work in grammar, then that's what you are really. And you're going to use corpus methods to do it. And I think if you get that, then it helps you see what you're doing and how to position yourself, and what the gap is you're trying to fill, and how you can do that through corpora. So I think those would be the two big ones.
And finally, what will corpus research look like in 50 years?
I just think all of linguistics will be corpus linguistics in 50 years. I don't think there'll be much left, actually. I think there'll be stuff being done in cognitive science using, and in psycholinguistics and stuff that uses experiments and other types of methods to get into the brain. But I think if you're not interested in being in the brain, if you're not interested in doing mentalist linguistics, and even many people who will be working entirely with corpora. I'm not sure it'll be being done in linguistics. I think the resistance to corpora in linguistics, which is still there to some extent, at least among influential older members of the community, would be the death of linguistics moving forward. And maybe that will be happening in computer science or in natural language processing or data science. I mean, there's already a lot of that research coming out. But I think most scientific research on language will, especially on language structure use as opposed to language cognition, will be based on corpora. And I think the rise of large language models is just the absolute evidence of just the value of corpus linguistics and how you can do corpus linguistics, and that's all you need to do to understand language structure. You don't need to elicit people. You don't need to get negative evidence. You can just look at what people do with language.
Well, let's see what happens in the coming years, and the almost exponential growth of corpus linguistics. It's
going to take off like never before. It's going to just be dominant. Yeah. It might not even be called. It'll just be called linguistics and language.
Yes. Models, yeah. Well, we will bring things to a close at this point. Thank you so much, Jack, for your time and for coming on. It's been a really interesting conversation and great to chat with you about you and your work. And of course, thank you, our viewers and listeners, for joining us once again for this episode of CorpusCast. Do let us know your thoughts about this and other episodes using the hashtag CorpusCast. And you can check out the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group on Twitter at Aston Corpus, and I am at Lovermob. CorpusCast is an Aston Originals podcast hosted by me, Robbie Love, and produced by Sam Cook. So thanks again to you, our listeners, and thank you, Jack Grieve. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today, and hope to see you all soon on the next episode of CorpusCast. Thank you.
Thank you.